There comes a point in every narcissist's life when the game stops working. The charm fades, people see through the lies, and the power they fed on begins to crumble. Psychologists explain that this collapse is inevitable, because manipulation can't hold forever. When it all ends, the narcissist is left scrambling, and what they end up doing may shock you. At first, denial takes over. Narcissists cannot accept that the supply of attention is gone. They try to convince themselves nothing has changed. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. They'll pretend life is perfect, post smiles online, or brag about success, even as everything falls apart behind closed doors. Denial becomes their shield against reality. Next comes rage. Psychologists highlight that when their mask cracks, narcissists lash out at those who once admired them. They blame, smear, or attack, desperate to regain control. But this rage backfires, driving more people away. Instead of power, they breed fear and avoidance. What they end up doing is burning every bridge they once depended on. Some turn to hoovering, reaching out to old victims. Psychologists explain that when supply runs dry, narcissists dig into the past. They send sweet messages, fake apologies, or sudden confessions. But these gestures aren't about love, they're about survival. What they're really saying is, "I need your attention again." And when ignored, they spiral deeper into collapse. Others distract themselves with reckless behavior. Psychologists note that without admiration, many narcissists chase quick thrills, overspending, drinking, or pursuing shallow relationships. These distractions offer temporary relief, but create more chaos. Instead of rebuilding, they dig a deeper hole. Their refusal to face reality leaves them trapped in cycles of self-destruction. When isolation sets in, the narcissist panics. Psychologists emphasize that these individuals fear loneliness above all else. Their entire identity is built on being seen. When people stop engaging, they're left with emptiness they can't tolerate. To fill it, they might gossip, stir drama, or provoke conflict. Anything to feel relevant again, even if it's toxic. Some narcissists turn into professional victims. Psychologists describe how they flip the script, claiming they were abused or misunderstood. By painting themselves as martyrs, they hope to regain sympathy. But this strategy eventually collapses too, as patterns repeat. People grow tired of their endless blame shifting, and the spotlight fades once more, leaving them exposed. As the end deepens, regret creeps in, but not the healthy kind. Psychologists explain that narcissists regret losing control, not losing people. They don't miss you for who you are. They miss how you made them feel powerful. This twisted regret drives them to search desperately for replacements, but none can fill the void left behind. Many begin rewriting history. Psychologists highlight that they'll lie even to themselves, saying, "I never cared anyway," or "they were the problem." This self-deception protects their fragile ego but prevents healing. By avoiding truth, they lock themselves in a prison of illusions, unable to grow. What they end up doing is living inside their own lies. Ultimately, when it all ends, the narcissist faces what they've feared their entire life: the mirror. Psychologists remind us that without supply, they're left with emptiness, shame, and insecurity. Their mask is gone, and there's nowhere to hide. Some crumble, others lash out, but all are forced to confront the truth they've spent years running from. When the narcissist realizes no one is listening anymore, desperation takes over. Psychologists explain they may create exaggerated crises, sudden illnesses, dramatic stories, or financial disasters, just to pull people back into their orbit. These fabrications are designed to provoke pity, but as patterns repeat, even the most loyal begin to see through the lies. Narcissists also start searching for new supply in unlikely places. Psychologists note that they'll try to manipulate coworkers, distant relatives, or even strangers online. The desperation becomes obvious, because the charm feels forced and the tactics predictable. What they end up doing is exhausting everyone around them, proving that without constant admiration, they unravel. Some retreat into fantasy. Psychologists describe how, when reality feels unbearable, Narcissists invent grand stories about their success, love life, or importance. These fantasies soothe their ego temporarily, but they also isolate them further. People stop believing their words, leaving them trapped in a world of their own making, where lies feel safer than truth. When power slips away, narcissists often double down on control in small areas. Psychologists explain they may nitpick, dominate conversations, or obsess over trivial routines. These small victories give them a fleeting sense of authority, but in reality they highlight how powerless they've become. Once rulers of chaos, they shrink to tyrants of details. Some narcissists lash out through smear campaigns. Psychologists emphasize that when losing power, they attack reputations of those who escaped. They spread rumors, twist stories, and play the victim. But these attempts often expose them further. As people connect the dots, the narcissist loses credibility, and what was meant to destroy others instead destroys their own image. Isolation becomes their harshest punishment. Psychologists remind us that narcissists cannot survive without an audience. When their circle shrinks, they sit in silence with emotions they've always avoided: shame, fear, emptiness. For many, this silence feels unbearable. They may distract themselves with noise, but the emptiness remains, reminding them of the love they lost. At times, they spiral into reckless relationships. Psychologists note that narcissists, desperate for supply, jump quickly into new romances. They rush the intensity, seeking validation. But these relationships collapse even faster because the old patterns resurface. Each failure reinforces the truth they cannot face. The problem was never others, but themselves. Some narcissists try to reinvent themselves. Psychologists highlight that they'll claim sudden transformation, spiritual awakening, therapy, or newfound humility. But often, this is another performance, a tactic to regain admiration. Without true accountability, change remains surface level. What they end up doing is recycling the same cycle in a new disguise. The more they struggle, the more transparent their manipulation becomes. Psychologists explain that once people recognize patterns, the narcissist's tricks lose effect. Where once they inspired sympathy, now they inspire exhaustion. What they end up doing is repeating the same lines, unaware that their audience no longer buys the act, leaving them exposed and powerless. Some fall into bitterness. Psychologists describe how they fixate on betrayal, convinced the world is against them. This bitterness poisons every conversation, driving others further away. What they end up doing is isolating themselves with anger, feeding on resentment instead of healing. Their refusal to let go ensures the cycle of pain continues. At the end, many narcissists also experience envy like never before. Psychologists highlight that they obsessively compare themselves to those who left. Seeing others happy and free reminds them of their own emptiness. What they end up doing is silently watching, seething at the life they lost, unable to admit they were the reason it slipped away. Some narcissists develop compulsive habits to fill the void. Psychologists explain they may turn to workaholism, addictions, or endless distractions. Each new obsession is a bandage, not a cure. Instead of facing inner emptiness, they cover it with noise. But when the distraction fades, the loneliness grows louder, leaving them more broken than before. Others cling to the past. Psychologists note that they'll rehash old glories, reminding anyone who will listen of their best days. They may talk about old successes, past relationships, or achievements, but their nostalgia reveals their reality. The present feels empty. What they end up doing is living in memories because the future feels too uncertain. Some narcissists collapse into depression. Psychologists emphasize that when the mask fails completely, the emptiness inside overwhelms them. Without supply, they feel worthless because their identity was built on external validation. What they end up doing is withdrawing, consumed by despair, yet still resisting the one thing that could help: true self-reflection. Even in collapse, many resist therapy. Psychologists explain that narcissists fear admitting fault. They may dabble in counseling but often quit when confronted. What they end up doing is sabotaging their own healing, preferring the illusion of strength over the vulnerability of growth. Sadly, this ensures the cycle continues, keeping them trapped in their own prison. Some narcissists try to reinvent their image in public. Psychologists highlight how they suddenly act generous, supportive, or humble in front of others. But behind closed doors, little changes. These performances may fool strangers, but not those who know the truth. What they end up doing is living a double life, exhausting themselves to maintain appearances. Others chase status symbols. Psychologists note that when love and respect disappear, they replace it with money, possessions, or titles. They may flaunt cars, homes, or careers as proof of success. But these symbols can't fill the void inside. What they end up doing is chasing shadows, mistaking image for identity, and still feeling empty at night. As endings approach, some narcissists become controlling over their remaining circle. Psychologists explain they tighten their grip on the few people who stay, demanding loyalty. This creates toxic dependency, suffocating those who remain. But eventually, even the most devoted pull away. What they end up doing is destroying the last of their support system. The collapse of a narcissist is slow but certain. Psychologists emphasize that their tactics, rage, denial, manipulation, become less effective over time. What they end up doing is recycling old tricks in desperation, unaware that their audience has changed. The curtain falls, and what's left is not the mask, but the raw emptiness they've always hidden. And when everything ends, narcissists face a terrifying truth. They are alone with themselves. Psychologists explain this is their deepest fear, because without supply, the mask crumbles. What they end up doing is anything to avoid silence, drama, lies, distractions, but none of it works. In the end, the narcissist cannot escape the reality they spent a lifetime denying. At this stage, some narcissists desperately seek replacements, yet every new supply feels weaker. Psychologists explain that nothing compares to the intensity of their old control. They cycle through friends, partners, or groups, but none stay for long. What they end up doing is chasing one hollow connection after another, proving the emptiness they cannot fill. Others turn to rage against society itself. Psychologists note that when their personal power collapses, they blame the world. They rant about unfairness, betrayal, or changing values. This outward anger masks their inner collapse. What they end up doing is alienating even more people, proving that their downfall is driven as much by their bitterness as by their lies. Narcissists often replay the past in obsessive cycles. Psychologists explain that they go over old arguments, imagining how they should have won. This mental looping is not healing, it's rumination. What they end up doing is living in a mental courtroom where they're always the victim, wasting energy on stories that no longer matter to anyone else. As collapse deepens, some narcissists grow paranoid. Psychologists highlight that they believe everyone is talking about them, plotting against them, or celebrating their failure. This paranoia reflects their fragile ego, unable to accept responsibility. What they end up doing is pushing away even allies, convinced that trust is impossible, leaving themselves surrounded by shadows. In rare cases, some attempt genuine reflection. Psychologists stress that only a few face their patterns honestly. When they do, the pain is overwhelming because they must confront decades of destruction. What they end up doing is grappling with guilt, shame, and fear. For some, this can spark growth, but for most, the weight is too heavy to bear. Financial collapse is another frequent outcome. Psychologists explain that narcissists often overspend to maintain an image. When it all ends, debts catch up, and admiration fades. What they end up doing is scrambling for survival, sometimes exploiting others for money. But without trust, doors close, leaving them exposed not just emotionally, but financially as well. Some narcissists isolate completely. Psychologists note that the absence of supply leaves them retreating from society. They may avoid gatherings, friends, or even family. What they end up doing is hiding, hoping absence shields them from shame. Yet in isolation they face the one thing they cannot tolerate, their own reflection, unmasked and unadmired. Health often declines too. Psychologists highlight the connection between chronic stress, rage, and physical illness. When it all ends, many narcissists experience health issues they cannot ignore. What they end up doing is blaming others or circumstances, refusing to see the link between their behavior and their decline. Denial becomes their final barrier to truth. Narcissists also lose credibility permanently. Psychologists explain that once exposed, their reputation never fully recovers. Even when they attempt to rebuild, whispers of their past follow them. What they end up doing is trying to outrun their history, but it clings tightly. Without trust, every new start collapses, leaving them trapped in cycles of reinvention and failure. Their relationships crumble one by one. Psychologists note that family members, friends, and partners eventually grow tired of the endless drama. What they end up doing is pushing away everyone who once stood by them, often ending life surrounded only by acquaintances, not true connections. The emptiness they feared becomes reality, carved by their own choices. Some narcissists cling to self-delusion until the very end. Psychologists explain that they tell themselves stories of greatness, convincing themselves they never lost. But beneath the performance, they know the truth. What they end up doing is living in a fantasy that protects them from despair, but it also keeps them from ever experiencing real change. Others continue to manipulate even in decline. Psychologists highlight that instead of changing, they refine their tactics, targeting more vulnerable people. What they end up doing is preying on those too inexperienced to see the patterns, but each manipulation burns out quicker, leaving them with fewer options until even the vulnerable walk away. At the end, many narcissists live in regret, though they rarely admit it aloud. Psychologists emphasize that regret eats at them in silence. They think of the partners, children, or friends they pushed away, knowing they'll never return. What they end up doing is replaying what could have been, haunted by losses they can't repair or replace. Some mask this regret with arrogance. Psychologists explain that they boast louder than ever, exaggerating achievements. But the louder the performance, the emptier the reality. What they end up doing is performing for themselves, hoping lies will soothe their pain. Yet every boast reminds them of what they lost, because truth whispers louder than fantasy. Eventually, exhaustion takes over. Psychologists note that years of manipulation, rage, and denial wear them down. What they end up doing is slowing, no longer able to maintain the act. Their energy drains, and the mask cracks permanently. For many, this is the quiet collapse, less dramatic but more painful, as they realize the performance is over. Narcissists also experience envy of those who healed. Psychologists explain that seeing survivors of their abuse thrive is unbearable. What they end up doing is watching from afar, secretly comparing, knowing they'll never have that peace. Their envy is their punishment, because the freedom others found is the very thing they can never achieve. At times, they try last-ditch attempts to regain relevance. Psychologists describe how they may stir conflict, reach out with dramatic stories, or beg for another chance. But by now, their reputation precedes them. What they end up doing is embarrassing themselves because people recognize the pattern and refuse to play, leaving the narcissist powerless. In rare moments of clarity, they may see the truth, that their own actions led to their downfall. Psychologists highlight that this realization is both freeing and devastating. What they end up doing is either finally seeking change or collapsing deeper into despair. Few choose growth, but for those who do, it marks the first genuine step forward. Most, however, remain stuck. Psychologists explain that narcissists cling to old habits, unable to let go of their need for control. What they end up doing is repeating the same cycles until the end, chasing supply that never satisfies. Their lives end not with peace but with a hollow echo of the power they once pretended to hold. So when it all ends for a narcissist, what do they truly end up doing? They deny, rage, manipulate, spiral, and regret, but rarely heal. Psychologists remind us that their ending is not about punishment, it's about consequence. And the real victory lies in those who broke free. If this helped you understand, share it, subscribe, and never let their ending become yours.